Okay, so I just recorded to cloud and that's all. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so now it seems working okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, such a disruption and lots of people are not allowed to get in now.
I think Trish will be letting people
Yeah,
in.
okay, yeah. Okay, well, that's brilliant. So let's start. Sorry for all the interruption. Okay, so now we would like to warmly welcome our second speaker today, Professor Katherine Baxter from the University of Northumbria. Katherine is the Prof Chancellor in the Department of Humanities at
Deputy Faculty Provost Chancellor. I'm not a Provost Chancellor. Not that important.
Missing reading one word. So she was awarded PhD from the University of Glasgow in 2003. And then she worked for several years in London, both as a lecturer and also as a catalogue and curator at the British Library. Very impressive. In 2007, she was appointed as research assistant professor in cross-cultural studies in English at the University of Hong Kong. She then moved in 2010 to the United States, where she was a lecturer at Stanford University before she joined Northumbria University in 2011. And her work is characterized by her long-standing interest in cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship, colonial and post-colonial literature from the main focus of her research, alongside an interest in literary multilingualism and law and literature studies. Very impressive. Thank you. So the floor is yours. Without further ado, I'll just leave it to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sai Hong. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today, both online and in person. It's really lovely to be here. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. So today I'm talking about Joseph Conrad's translation of a play by a Polish playwright called Bruno Winawer. The play was called The Book of Job. And yeah, my title is Translation Isn't Everything, but I will be talking quite a bit about translation, don't worry. So, okay. Oh, I'm just going to, for those in the room, move this a little bit up. So hopefully you can see the screen and move this a little bit over. There we go. Okay. So on the 10th of June, 1921, Conrad wrote to acknowledge receipt of a play script by Bruno Winawer, a comic playwright and popular science writer in Poland. He writes, "Dear Sir, thank you very much for sending me the comedy. As far as translation is concerned, I have no connections in the world where these things get done. Therefore, for the time being, I can think of nobody. And it seems to me that if I looked for someone to do the translation, it would be difficult to find someone suitable. I am very busy at the moment, but I hope to be more free in some 3 weeks and will then see what can be done. Translation, however, isn't everything. What you probably have in mind is placing the play with a London theatre. I must explain that although I have a fairly wide reputation, it is strictly confined to my own work. Personally, I have no influence in the publishing or theatrical world. I don't know a single actor or actress, director or capitalist entrepreneur, nor in fact do I have anything to do with the theatre. I must furthermore add that I have never met my publishers, either socially or in business. All my affairs are in the hands of Mr. J.B. Pinker, my literary agent and friend of 20 years standing, who acts on my behalf and sends me contracts to sign. That is the position. Your comedy appeals to me, so I'll try to do all I can, but please do not count on me. In any event, I shall write to you in 3 weeks' time. Pray accept my friendly regards, yours sincerely, Joseph Conrad." So as I sat at my desk last week, trying to put pen to paper for today's talk, I felt some sympathy for Conrad. At the time he received the script and his request for help finding a translator, Conrad had just seen his collection of non-fiction essays, notes on life and letters into print, and was about to begin a new novel, and was turning out a variety of other pieces for the newspapers. So the friendly but harried tone of his letter communicates a genuine interest, but also a genuine panic about getting caught up in another project that might cause him to, as he described it to his agent, neglect proper work. Moreover, there's another project that Conrad had on the go at the time he received this letter, and that was putting on the staging of his theatrical adaptation of his own novel, The Secret Agent. So 2 days before Conrad responded to Winawer, claiming complete ignorance of the stage and all its machinations, he'd written a long letter to the playwright John Galsworthy, who was a good mate of his, about a conversation that Galsworthy had had with an actor, director and manager who had also made inquiries about The Secret Agent. And we also know about some of this kind of nexus of conversation because he'd been talking with his friend and translator, Gerard Jean Aubry, about all of this. Jean Aubry was translating Conrad into French. So let's return to that letter to Winawer. Here we go. As far as translation is concerned, I have no connections in the world of where these things get done. Therefore, for the time being, I can think of nobody. It would be difficult to find someone suitable. This is a lie. In the summer, Conrad hosted a visit from his translator, Jean Aubry, and corresponded with another of his translators, André Gide. Meanwhile, back in Poland, his niece, Aniela Zagorska, was arranging to take the translation of Conrad in hand, including the stage adaptation of The Secret Agent. So his claim that he had no connections in the world to translation is just not true. If Conrad's claim to ignorance is only partially believable with regard to translation, his similar claims about the theatre are frankly comical. Here they are again. I must explain that although I have a fairly wide reputation, it's strictly confined to my own work. Personally, I have no influence in the publishing world, or publishing or theatrical world. I don't know any of these kinds of people. If we look at Conrad's letters over the previous 12 months, not only is he corresponding with his friend, the playwright, John Galsworthy, and others about putting on his own play, The Secret Agent, he's also talking to Galsworthy about Galsworthy's plays too. Moreover, in a letter to his agent in April 1921, so just a couple of months before he heard from Winawer, he records meeting with McKinnell, this actor, the playwright Ernest Cecil, and McKinnell's business partner, and they discussed casting the actress Catherine Willard in The Secret Agent. And Conrad then undertook to get in contact with Catherine Willard to ask if she'd be available for the play. Following that meeting, he then went off to his publishers and had a bit of a chat with them about publication of his collected works. So here, in a single 24 hours, we find Conrad hobnobbing with directors, managers, playwrights, and publishers in kind of pretty leisurely fashion and corresponding with friendly warmth with an actress. Nonetheless, despite all these protestations and claims that he didn't know anything about this, even though he clearly did, he actually sat down and produced a translation of the play by dictation within about 10 days. So before I get onto the translation itself, and I promise I will do, even if my title is Translation Isn't Everything, I want to take a moment or two to explain who Bruno Winawer was and what his play was about. And for much of what I'm about to say here, I'm indebted to the work of Grażyna Broni, whose article on Conrad's translation of the Book of Job is hugely informative. I'll give a reference to it a little bit later on. So Bruno Winawer, who we see here in kind of cartoon form in a kind of caricature at the front of his self-published play, began his career as a physicist before turning to the theatre, where he gained a respectable reputation as a comic playwright. Throughout the 20s and 30s, however, he was even more successful as a popular science writer, And in a series of regular columns for popular periodicals, Winawer introduced scientific ideas such as Einstein's theory of relativity to generalist audiences through kind of a really engaging and lucid prose. As a comic playwright, Winawer, like several other Polish playwrights of the period, was influenced by George Bernard Shaw, and he was kind of at the height of his powers really in the first 20 years of the 20th century. And Winawer sort of follows in Shaw's path, embracing humorous paradox, witty turns of phrase and aphorisms. As Broni notes, this was a radical departure for Polish comedy, which had been dominated by farce before the First World War. Winawer's lightness of touch and the twinkling repartee of his dialogue was a welcome innovation amongst Polish theatregoers, particularly in the post-war period, although he wrote before the war as well. It's worth noting the particular post-war context for Polish theatre in the 1920s, since the end of the war had brought the long sought for independence of Poland as a nation state. While a more revolutionary movement in Polish theatre, which had already been set in train by Wyspiański before the war, and while that more revolutionary movement reflected on the political and social implications of independence, Winawer maintained a kind of a lighter touch. His comedies take a more sideways glance, satirizing middle-class morality and intellectual pretense, and only occasionally allowing the impact of the war and independence to figure kind of in passing. There is therefore a quality of, been trying to think of how to describe this, but a kind of ephemerality to the Book of Job, both in terms of what it satirizes and the literary means by which it does so. So what we end up with is a kind of a pretty absurdist kind of play, certainly in the plot of the Book of Job. Herod, the central protagonist, is a renowned scientist, but he's financially reliant on his wife, who, as a music hall singer, makes more money than he does on his university wages. His wife invites her ne'er-do-well friends to use their home as a gambling club. And when the house is raided by the police, Herod, the professor, decides that the most honorable thing he can do is to claim responsibility, thus saving his wife's reputation. He makes up a series of absurdly unlikely stories about a former life as an international card sharp, and is sent down with the leader of the gambling club, Macca, and they spend some time in jail. The final act sees Herod and Macca released from jail, and their plan is to pursue a life of crime, which Herod argues in kind of George Bernard Shaw kind of fashion, is of all the uncreative trades or professions, the most honest upon the whole. However, when he gets home, Herod finds a letter awaiting him from an American company offering to commercialize one of his inventions. And so he leaves the life of crime for corporate wealth in the States, taking with him a Warsaw flapper who he promises to marry. As he comments, ironically, for a price like this, I really must consent to remain an honest man. So the play presents a post-war Warsaw where social values have been turned upside down. Herod explains to his wife early on that the origin of our unhappiness springs from the fact that you and I are much too clever. You and I, with our university diplomas, were never fit to deal with the problems of life or ready to meet the smallest difficulty. But with such a flimsy plot, Winawer relies on the wit of his dialogue to communicate his gentle satire. And this has consequences for Conrad's translation, because it means all the work of the play is happening in the dialogue that he has to focus on rather than in the action. So let's turn back to that translation. You'll remember Conrad said that he was going to write back in 3 weeks. Well, it took him 2 months rather, to tell Winawer that he had decided to translate the play himself. And this is when he wrote this is his letter back to Winawer, attaching a copy of the translation. The first reading will no doubt exasperate you, but I am confident that after a time you will discover an amount of fidelity to your thought, and even your expression, which you could not have been able to find in any other translation more accurately verbal. You will no doubt notice that it is strictly idiomatic, and you may take it from me that the idioms are absolutely correct and employed in strict accordance with your artistic intention. My guiding idea was to make the work acceptable to a theatrical audience. In one or two places, you will discover a certain shortening of speeches, but nothing material has been missed. I have also summarized, rather than translated, the preliminary descriptive matter, leaving just enough to guide the English actors. In one or two places, I have altered the phrasing so as to make the thought more accessible to the English or American public, and have taken the liberty to invent names of certain characters in order to make them acceptable to the ears of the audience. This account of his translation is accurate, but not exactly. So crucially, Conrad doesn't translate the lengthy introduction and this kind of postscript review which Winawer included in his play, and which are, and my Polish-speaking friends confirm this, hilarious and provide a playful interpretive framework to the Book of Job's ludic and nihilistic social satire. Conrad's right that this sort of material that sits around the play doesn't provide practical stage directors to the actors, but without it, the skittish and ironic intent of the play is not immediately apparent to actors, directors, or to readers. Winawer's self-penned review at the end of the play script notes, for example, that people go to the theatre irrespective of their profession. They are maniacs, deranged men, those who cannot adapt to new ways of life. And so here Winawer's gently mocking his own audience while also pointing out their affinities with his protagonist, Herop, who finds himself at the start of the play feeling deranged by the topsy-turvy society of post-war Poland. At the same time, those who know anything of Winawer's own biography would have recognized that Herop is also kind of a version of Winawer. So Winawer becomes a member of this theatre-going club of maniacs. Rereading Conrad's letter, I'm struck by his claim that Winawer could not have been able to find the fidelity Conrad brings to the translation in any other more accurately verbal than Conrad's own. It's a grand claim, but it's an unclear one too. So this letter was dictated to Conrad's secretary and amanuensis, Lilian Hallowes, and I assume that as he reached the end of a rather long-winded sentence in dictation, he simply muddled his words and got them the wrong way round. More verbally accurate makes more sense in the context. If he means more verbally accurate, this suggests that an alternative, more literal translation that might render the individual Polish words accurately would fail to capture the spirit of the play. But if we take Conrad at his word for a moment, more accurately verbal suggests something different, perhaps something closer to spoken English, perhaps, rather than the script as printed text. The slippage from more verbally accurate to more accurately verbal unwittingly gestures, as it happens, to some of the problems we find in Conrad's translation. With regard to the absolutely correct idioms, Grażyna Broni has demonstrated amply the way in which Polonisms and unidiomatic Polish pepper the text from beginning to end. So Grażyna notes that Conrad uses actual to mean current, on account of instead of for the sake of, and refers to a clean man instead of an honest man. And instead of looking askance at Mrs. Herop, a house porter gives her a sideways look, which is a kind of translation of spodiowa, so sort of a sideways look rather than looking askance. So it's not particularly idiomatic. And Broni also draws our attention to how Polish syntax shapes Conrad's translation. So a ja się łudziłam przez chwilę, in Conrad's prose is, I continue not to understand, which is kind of quite a literal translation of that Polish, rather than the more idiomatic, I still don't understand. But when we look at the original typescript, which Conrad edited by hand, we can see in his revisions he was trying to move from a literal to an idiomatic translation. So in the opening scene of the typescript, we have, "No, I have taken the stage in horror. This is nearly a year since I've been officially obliged to go to all the first nights. This isn't an occupation for an intelligent person. The curtain raises, you see 3 badly painted walls and 3 badly made up faces. Afterwards, devil only knows why, there comes some dreary old low intrigue. He, she, lover. Will they get together or won't they get together? How can I possibly care for it? I'm not a matrimonial agent." And we can see in the revised typescript, I've highlighted in red on the screen where there are changes in words and the kind of structure. "No, I have now horror of the stage. I've been attending officially all the first nights for a year." Sorry, I think I'll just, just press decline. "This is a deadly occupation for an intelligent person. The curtain raises, you see 3 badly painted walls and 3 badly made up faces. Afterwards, devil only knows why, there comes to light some dreary old love intrigue. A he, a she, a lover. Will they get married? Won't they get married? How can I possibly care?" So in the shortening of "how can I possibly care," for example, we see a move from a literal to a more idiomatic phrasing in the translation. What remains, however, particularly in the opening passages, is this structuring framework of Polish syntax. So here's in the original dictated typescript, a passage where it starts, "I will tell you what I think. People have got to get through a few idle hours every day. A gang of various exploiters has persuaded them that the best thing, that the proper thing, is to kill time in the theatre, or in looking at pictures, or in listening to a concert, because they say it lifts you spiritually, it ennobles your character. I have been in the police now for a year, and the whole year I had to, as a matter of duty, to attend those ennobling pastimes. I assure you that I've become more stupid than ever before. I'm going to try for an exchange to the juridical department for fear of becoming a complete idiot. Do you see?" And in the revised typescript, we get this. And again, we've got it in red. "So I'll tell you what I think. People must get through a few idle hours every day." And then I'll scoot on a bit, but because they say it lifts you spiritually, it ennobles your character. I have been in the police for a year, and I have had to attend as a matter of duty those ennobling pastimes. I assure you that I am now more stupid than ever before. I had to manage an exchange to the juridical department simply to save myself from becoming a complete idiot. Are you listening? In the sentence that begins, "I have been in the police," we see Conrad wrangling his phrasing out of its initial literal relationship to the Polish and into something closer to the structure of spoken English. Doing this on the page, however, and with the words already in front of him, we can see how he struggles to get the right effect and how the familiar syntax of Polish holds the words fast in their place, even as he tries to find a more idiomatic turn of phrase. With the words given, so to speak, through his initial process of literal translation, he seems kind of trapped by the syntactic relations and functions and unable or unwilling to move away from his initial literal choices to a more fluent paraphrase. And my feeling is this is where the ephemerality of Winawer's play creates a challenge for Conrad as a not terribly adept translator. In the first pages of his translation, Conrad deleted many of Winawer's references to the cultural zeitgeist of post-war Warsaw, presumably to make the thought more accessible to the English and American public, if you think back to that letter. As he goes on, however, more of these remain, and at the same time, as Veroni observes, Conrad seems to become increasingly absorbed in the action. But as my synopsis makes clear, I hope, there is pretty scant action in which to become absorbed. It's not a play that's full of action, it's all about kind of conversation. And so without the points of social reference, the ideas either become really kind of weighty and leaden, kind of too heavy for the plot to sustain, or they simply get lost in the process of translation. The ephemeral quality of the original, which is part of its pleasure, evades translation. So despite the challenges that Conrad faced in translating the play, he made quick work of it. Within 4 days of acknowledging receipt of Winawer's play, he sent it off the revised typescript of the first act to his agent to ask for a clean copy to be typed up. And within 11 days, he'd finished a full draft. As his letters make clear, he did then take some steps to see if those he knew in the theatre might be interested. And he showed it to his French friend and translator, Jean Aubrey. In a letter to his agent, he records that Jean Aubrey read the play and considers it very good indeed, showing distinct signs of Shaw's influence in its general conception and of Arthur Schnitzler in its construction. Nonetheless, the ambivalence we can detect in Conrad's original letter to Winawer remained, and it characterizes not just the translation, but also these somewhat desultory efforts to see it staged. Despite the implication in 1 or 2 of his letters that he would continue to polish it, that doesn't seem to have happened. In the following spring, he approached the actor and director Alan Wade to ask his opinion of the play. Wade responded that he'd be willing to approach the Stage Society on Conrad's behalf, and Conrad replied that a performance by the Stage Society has always struck me as a sort of cheerful funeral ceremony. So it's basically saying this is a play that's going to die, so if it gets performed by the Stage Society, so it's a sort of happy way of seeing it off. And he makes the following request with regard to his own association with the play. What I would like is that when it gets as far as the bill stage, Mr. X, which is the title that Conrad gave himself as translator on the typescript, should remain, while at the same time everybody would know who Mr. X is. It would fit the spirit of the comedy that all London should know it, which would still leave about 5 million people in the dark. So this is a little homage to the owl who was hooting outside my window while I was making these slides last night. So why did Conrad undertake this translation, the owl asks. After all, Winawer was not, as far as we know, a friend of Conrad's before he took the initiative to send him a copy of his play. Brani argues persuasively that there's no evidence that Conrad was even familiar with Winawer's works before he took on the translation. He had lots of other demands on his time, as he makes clear not only to Winawer, but also to his other correspondents. He wasn't making that bit up. And no one needed him to do this. So why did he? There are 2 reasons I think we can entertain. Firstly, Conrad undertook the project to produce what he called some work of an unusual character, which he could sell for quick cash. So the turn of the century had seen a boom in the market for contemporary literary manuscripts. So there'd always been a market for older manuscripts, but at this time people started actually selling manuscripts in their own lifetime. So Conrad, for example, first began to make money from the sale of his own works, manuscripts, typescripts, proofs, that sort of thing, through an arrangement with the collector John Quinn, a wealthy New Yorker. At the end of the First World War, Conrad began to sell to another collector, Thomas Wise, who was based in London. Wise was an avid collector, and his proximity to Conrad made him an easy customer. It was harder to send stuff to the States at that time. At least that's what Conrad said to Quinn. I think Wise would just buy anything, was part of it. Within 11 days of getting Winawer's play, or at least acknowledging receipt of it, within 11 days, Conrad had written to this collector, Wise, offering him first refusal on the typescript and suggesting £100 as an agreeable price. £100 was a tidy sum of money in 1921. And even though Conrad was, by this time, a well-known author, he was always in need of money because he and his wife both suffered quite a lot of ill health. So £100 was a useful bit of money to get from being able to produce this translation. So it gave him something unusual, which a collector would be willing to pay a high price for. Secondly, we might argue that Conrad, ever the experimenter, was intrigued by this low-risk opportunity to turn his hand to something new, which, if nothing came out of it, kind of cost him little, it only took him 10 days, but which had the potential to provide additional publishing and potentially performance opportunities if it went well. The fact that his own works were going into translation at this time likely sharpened his appreciation for this field of work, so he'd maybe start to think, maybe this is something I can do too. Indeed, writing to his agent after he completed the translation of the first act, he says, "I must say, it has given me some amusement, and even more, a renewed assurance in the handling of the language, for it was not easy to do." So these two reasons are not mutually exclusive, of course. So he may well have been looking to make some money and explore something new. I want to make a swerve here, though, and conclude by suggesting a different value to the translation, one of which Conrad could never have known. So because the translation was dictated, there are moments where Lilian Hallowes, his amanuensis, misunderstands Conrad's accented English. Conrad spoke with an accent to the end of his life. And in doing so, she types something that is not perhaps verbally accurate, but is accurately verbal, we could say, because it records the sound of Conrad's voice. So in the first passage we looked at earlier, you might have noticed that Conrad changed dreary old low intrigue to dreary old love intrigue. I've kind of highlighted those there for you. This mistake, so this is not a change made to improve the idiom of the translation. A low intrigue is different from a love intrigue. It's not that there's an idiomatic problem. What's happened here is that Lilian Hallowes heard Conrad say low when actually he said love. And this mistake helps us reconstruct, albeit briefly, the sound of Conrad's pronunciation with a very soft V sound. And it's pure conjecture, but I also wonder whether this blurring of the W and the V sound in Conrad's pronunciation was exacerbated by the fact that he was engaging with Polish, where a W gets pronounced as a V, gets sounded as a V. So might his move between silent reading of Polish and dictation into English have created a kind of slippage in his pronunciation as his brain's working through the two languages at the same time? Elsewhere, and possibly not related to this blurring of V and W, we find diverse, so D-I-V-E-R-C-E in the manuscript, with an E after the V for divorce. When you first see this, you might think it's just a typo, but when you look on the keyboard, E and O are in completely different places. And so it seems unlikely that this was just kind of mistyping, and possibly instead is a mishearing. And again, this gives us a tantalizing fragment of the sound of Conrad's voice, a flattened O, which might sound flat as a result of the soft V that comes before it, divorce, rather than divorce. There's a risk here, of course, of fetishizing the author. After all, we cannot know what Conrad sounded like exactly, and even were we to know, there are limits to the use of that knowledge. Nonetheless, what I do find useful is the evidence this gives us of the process of translation. As a literary scholar, rather than someone working in translation studies, I'm aware that in my discipline, we attend far less often to the process of translation rather than to its ends. We might argue over the accuracy of a translation, but we often don't think about what's happening in the process of translation. Going back to this, to manuscript and typescript materials, and using the tools of scholarly editing, which I've been using here, provides an alternative vantage point and raises different kinds of questions. We start to see the process of translation and to unpack why and how an act of translation took place. There's a privilege to this, of course, because manuscripts and typescripts aren't actually very easily available, right? They're often held, even if they're held in a public collection like the British Library, that's still a train ride at the very least for most of us, and for many of us much further. Moreover, not all manuscripts and typescripts survive. for all sorts of reasons. And these often also speak of privilege, the extent to which a translator and their works are actually valued, the privileging of certain languages over others. But, and this is where I'll conclude, for those of us who can, I'd like to suggest that we take a little more time, particularly those of us in literary studies, to attend to the different questions that examining the process of translation can raise, and more broadly, the kind of process of thinking between and across languages that we find in multilingual writers. I'm going to stop there. I've kind of tried to get us back on track with the time, but thank you very much. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for such a wonderful talk. I'll just maybe see if any of you have any questions.
Sure.
Or maybe even in the audience.
I'm not sure they can ask
yeah,
questions because it's
we
fully muted. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Well,
yeah.
Anyone have any questions here?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for sharing. My question is for multilingual translators or writers, because sometimes they may be affected by the source language, which is not their mother tongue, in the process. So, are there any solutions to this?
I don't know. I don't think there are, in a way. I mean, I think it's only, I mean, sort of the kind of Derridean in me wants to say that we never like own our mother tongue, right? This is sort of Derrida's argument. But on the other hand, so I wouldn't want to naturalize it, but I think it is only natural at some level that our first language starts to, our kind of mother tongue, particularly if we're working out of that as part of the translation, is going to shape where we go with it, right? I suppose that what would be interesting is with somebody who is, say, trilingual, if they were working between the two languages that weren't mother tongue, whether mother tongue would still inform that process. Say you were a German speaker and you moved between French and sort of Mandarin, then what does the German inform the French Mandarin translation? I absolutely don't know. But I mean, Conrad was trilingual, and what's interesting actually is that, and one of the issues with those letters that I was showing you that Conrad sent to Winawer is that we don't have the originals. What we have is Bruno Winawer typed them out. Sometimes Conrad wrote to Winawer in Polish. Sometimes Conrad wrote to Winawer in English. Winawer translated the Polish letters into French, and when he typed them out, so he didn't keep them in Polish. And so what we have are these copies that are in French and in English, but we don't have the Polish. So where sometimes when I'm looking at them in a collected letters that translates them back into English. So I'm not, there's a sort of stuff that may be being lost in that kind of process of translation. And the bit that we don't have is what happens when Bruno Winawer makes that, because the original is lost. We just have Bruno Winawer's version. Yeah, thank you. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I think naturally we're always going to be shaped by those languages, but I think sometimes the other languages we learn then kind of can sort of have an impact on each other as well, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Definitely does. I remember when I first moved to the UK, I always tend to use the English to replace any English words that I don't know.
Yeah.
Or I even tend to pronounce the English words in the English pronunciation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's that common.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Really interesting question. I mean, is that something you've experienced as you working in translation? Yeah.
Especially from Chinese to English, which are quite different.
Yeah.
And I would be affected by the syntax structures.
Yeah. Yeah. I think syntax is one of those really hard things, isn't it, to kind of unbreak. And even just that process of learning that words can go in a different order. I think it's like one of those threshold moments where you realize in another language the verb can be in a completely different place. Like, okay, that sort of changes everything. But yeah, it's quite, that it shows us how, I guess, embedded that is, that we always assume they go this way, and that to then kind of like, okay, we can move them around, or they might be, there might be other rules than other languages. Yeah.
If we don't have any more questions,
Yeah,
I don't know if there is any more questions.
Well, thank you for your question,
thank
and
you
thank
very
you
much,
again for
Catherine.
coming
Thank
to
you
the
very much
audience
for your
online as
wonderful
well.
talk. And just sincerely apologize, we cannot answer
Yeah.
questions from the participants. So hopefully we will sort it out this problems for next week. So that we
Yeah.
have some more
Stop sharing.
discussions online.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you,
And
everybody.
thanks again for your wonderful presentation. So let's give a big
Thank
applause.
you.
Thank you so much for coming all the way to Stirling.
No problem.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so we just thank you very much, everybody, for coming to Stirling's the 9th Translation Studies event. Do apologize for all these interruptions today. So hopefully there won't be such case or similar issues for next week. So our next week we will start at 10 o'clock in the UK, so which means around 5 o'clock in China. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. So goodbye, take care. So I'll just leave the meeting now.